Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Building Resilience Against Software Supply Chain Attacks. My name is Larry Wiggins. I'm the Vice President of Security, Technology, and Operations at Cloudflare. As part of my role in Technology and Operations and Security, I handle incident response, vulnerability management, and security engineering. So well-versed in all of the problems that we get from supply chain attacks and hopefully how to fix them, solve them, or at least mitigate them. Before we begin, jump into the all-important disclaimer. Although I think I'm giving some sound advice, please use your own independent professional judgment. All right, we'll start off with a little bit of a quote. So 2 quotes from the same poem. The first one, good fences make good neighbors. Everybody has likely heard this one before, but it really relates to kind of the old way of doing cybersecurity, where you implement your technology, you put in 1 or more firewalls, you punch holes in those firewalls to make your connectivity, but because everything's kind of in its own little box, in its own little data center, you don't really have an issue with how transient everything is. The second quote, something there that doesn't level wall and makes gaps even 2 can pass, really relates to when you start talking about SaaS and you start talking about multi-cloud providers and integrating everything and then adding in your users. You're punching so many holes in a firewall, and as it relates to supply chain, you're actually bringing code into the environment. So whatever firewall you had, you just bypassed it by bringing that code in. So we're going to talk a little bit about it. So I want to start with what do we mean by supply chain attacks versus maybe a regular attack. So starting on the right-hand side, the enterprise, that's you. I'm confident that everybody's running a well-controlled, really secure organization. No misconfigurations, no vulnerabilities on the operating systems or databases. But you're building software, or you're installing somebody else's software. So you get a first-level problem with your in-house developed apps, and how do you develop those? And you've all got SDLC lifecycles and code scanning and all of these tools that you're using. Or you're purchasing an application, and you go through your vendor analysis of how does the vendor do their source code analysis? How do they import their libraries? What controls do they have in their environment to make sure that they're well controlled? But that's where it kind of stops for an enterprise, right? Like you can't go to their third parties, or you can't go to the open source libraries that you're importing and do really strong analysis. You're kind of stuck at that 4th and 5th and 6th parties. So it really trickles all the way down throughout the environment. And you're really ultimately reliant from a supply chain attack on all of those being in lockstep and having sound security practices. So, impact by numbers, 76% of organizations with a third-party role that'll allow for complete account takeover. And this is, a lot of times it's a SaaS application that's plugged in and it's got administrator credentials because that was the easiest thing to do. And the implementer or the installer or the software itself said, we absolutely have to have administrator credentials. We could never work with anything less. So you deployed the administrator credentials, you gave it access to the firewall, and now they're experiencing an incident, and that's bleeding over into your organization where they can create users and make changes in the environment. And then second number, 29% of all breaches in 2023 were attributed to a third-party attack. So these are not missing patches on that an enterprise could have installed themselves. These are related to a third party. And I think the curious thing about this number for me is it's 29% of breaches. So that's what was disclosed, because we all know that companies will have a non-disclosable breach or they'll have an incident that they don't talk about. So I'd be really curious what that number is from an incident perspective, because my experience has been the number of incidents that I was working on-prem or in my own IT environment was much lower than the number of third-party incidents that I was working through. I was spending much more of my time, my incident response team's time, working through those third-party incidents, spending much more time with legal, getting out letters of demand saying, what's your status as it relates to this vulnerability? So we'll talk a little bit about MOVEit, not to pick on MOVEit or beat it to death too much, but $10 billion estimated total cost, 1,000 businesses that were known to be victimized. 60 million individuals, 85% of North American countries. That 85% of North American countries is huge. Worldwide, it's also much bigger. But I want to talk a minute about my experience with MOVEit. So, from an incident for me for MOVEit, we obviously saw the vulnerability headlines, and the first call from the CISO was, do we have MOVEit in the organization? So you start the usual tricks, right? You check the CMDB because it's the most trustworthy source. CMDB says no MOVEit in the environment. CISO says, can you check again? So we go ask the vulnerability team, hey, in all of your scanning, have you seen MOVEit anywhere in the environment? No, we've never seen MOVEit in the environment. Go talk to purchasing. Have you ever signed a contract with MOVEit? No, we're good. So we're about 3 days in. We've gone through legal. We've gone through IT. Hey, casually, anybody using MOVEit? No, we're not using MOVEit. We get into about day three, MOVEit's continuing to blow up. Legal sending out demands to all of our suppliers. Hey, do you use MOVEit? No, we're good. We don't use MOVEit. And then we start hearing the fourth parties that our vendors are using. And our vendors are starting to trickle back in with, well, we don't use it, but our vendors use it. We've had an impact, but you're okay. Okay, can you send us a letter confirming that none of our data has gone missing? So it all works out, but it's like we spend those first critical days making sure that there's nothing in our environment. But it's the following weeks, months, where we're still learning how MOVEit impacts our environment. I think to me, that's the critical issue with supply chain, is you can never stop investigating it, because it may end up just, oh yeah, it was a random thing. One guy installed it on his desktop. No, we don't use it, but he was working with a vendor that used it. So, yeah, that was MOVEit for me, and Log4j was very similar. All right, common software supply chain attacks. Really what I want to talk about here is they're everywhere, right? It's the imported libraries, and everybody knows the dependency confusion, whether it's the typo squatted domain, whether it's a package name. It's some way to say when you're using the import statements in your Python, your Ruby, your Perl, your whatever it is, you're pulling down a library, and if you can confuse or you don't fully justify where that library should come from, you've got a dependency confusion attack. Upstream server, did they hack something else in the environment, and they're using that to inject to add source code, to add different libraries to the environment. Attacking the developers directly. So whether it's via compromised Slack, Jira tickets, the IDE, everybody loves their own personal VS Code extensions. Attacking the developer's environment. Can you inject into the CI/CD pipeline, changing out or stealing the SSL certs so that code signing is no longer effective or decryption is no longer effective? And then finally, open source on the library in the application itself. So, 5 steps towards resiliency. The one thing I want to point out, and I'll go through each of these, is none of these in and of themselves are going to be the golden ticket. Some of them have some strengths in places, but relying on any one of them is going to leave you wanting. So, vendor risk assessment. I think everybody does these, but again, you're limited to your contract counterparties, right? And even that information is somewhat, questionable. Are you doing vulnerability scans? Absolutely. If you get them talking, what's the coverage on those vulnerability scans? Oh, it's just prod. Not dev, not test, not, is it an authenticated scan? The number of third-party incidents that I've worked where the first incident response step that they're taking is to deploy endpoint protection. Well, you told us when we did the third-party assessment that you had endpoint protection deployed. What happened? Well, we didn't have it on all the systems, but now it's on all the systems. So it's like, there's some limitations to these assessments, but they still have to be done. Still have to risk score. And incidentally, it's not just the contracts, it's also the open source. So be looking at the projects. How active are those projects? How many pull requests are being committed? Like, what's the life cycle of that open source? Because ultimately, if the project is languishing, if it's not getting updated, you're going to end up with issues that are unresolved. Risk identification, classification, are they compliant with standards? Tracking all of this and then recording all those answers, because when you get into the incidents and you get into the third-party supply chain attacks, you're going to want to know what those answers were and what vendors you may be working with that may have those software. So you bought the software, you downloaded the library, ongoing assurance and visibility. So continuous monitoring, continuing to scan for vulnerabilities, and most importantly, monitoring disclosures and advisories. So disclosures and advisories, watching not just the operating systems, the languages that you're using, all of the libraries that the developers want to use. So if they're importing it, you need to be tracking it as far as, is there a security advisory? And it's a lot, it's voluminous. So how to track it? CERT, vulnerability management, more eyes are better. It's a little bit maddening, but the two groups that I have tracking it are incident response, to see if there's an actual incident, and vulnerability management. Third-party code oversight. So anything that you download and install in your environment, you're going to want to manage from a dependency, making sure that you're on the latest versions. You're going to want to be applying the patches as they come out, not waiting, not dragging that out. But again, patch management only goes so far because you're always behind the curve on that. And oftentimes when there's a major supply chain attack, there is no known patch. It's or you've been on the version for months and you've got to figure out, well, was it attacked before that? And then all of this is fine, but ultimately, like, you've got limitations because you're dealing with third parties and their code, right? So you have to protect your own environment. So the first thing, limit your attack surface. This is whether you're in a traditional data center, whether you're in the cloud, like strapping things down with the firewall for storage accounts, for the non-traditional compute, whatever it may be, making sure that you've got as much limited space and zero trust access so that there's a legitimate reason for everything that's going through that firewall and accessing your environment. Second piece, preventing compromise. This is the patching, this is the ongoing monitoring of the entire environment. Limit lateral movement. So this is one that I think is critical. It's important to limit access to the environment, but once you're in the environment, you still need to be limited. So for instance, if they compromise a server via supply chain attack or any other vulnerability, they shouldn't be able to use that to pivot laterally. And the goal there is, just because they compromise one server, don't let them take off throughout the environment. Zero trust products should be able to do that. Micro-segmentation was big for a while. Firewalling, traditional network segmentation, all options. It really depends on how hairy and how involved you want to get with it. But ultimately, like, limiting lateral movement, not just from a network segmentation standpoint, but also where can a compromised account actually authenticate to? So they log into one server, but they should probably only be able to use that one server, not every server in the domain. And then finally, slow exfiltration and extortion. Make all the servers in the data center, all the servers in the cloud, pivot through one pathway to the internet and monitor that pathway. So all too often I've seen companies where getting in was hard, but getting out is way easy. So, our servers need to be able to talk to the internet for a variety of things. They really don't need to be out browsing the web or doing internet-related things like a user. So they need to stop. You can proxy all or most of that traffic and have very defined sites where your servers can go to, which will again slow the exfiltration. All right. So as far as protecting your environment, zero trust identity-based policies. So again, use identities, limit the scope of those identities, limit the scope of server and network access. And then where feasible, use MFA and hard key authentication. So users that are authenticating into the environment have to have a hard key token. And then securing the outbound access, DNS filtering, inspecting web traffic, making sure that you're generating logs for activity so that you can catch it with SIM or catch it in retrospect. And then isolate certain content categories. So one of the advantages of proxying outbound internet traffic for even servers is if a server starts to reach out to an unknown site or a malicious content site, it gets blocked. So there's literally no reason that a server would ever want to reach out to an unknown, an uncategorized site. Yet most companies, because they're not proxying that outbound traffic, their servers are out there talking to whatever traffic they want. And then the big question. You've got multi-cloud. You're in any of the public clouds. You're in multiple data centers. You've got your SaaS providers where they're hosting in whatever cloud. What's internal versus what's external? So it's kind of a mishmash. And that's where your zero trust has to be able to onboard your SaaS applications, has to be able to onboard your cloud providers, has to be able to onboard your on-prem servers so that they can all communicate securely. And that creates your quote-unquote internal network, even though a lot of that is actually external to your environment. And then minimizing impact. So we talked a little bit about zero trust. We do, for instance, zero trust internally. So even if an account is compromised, you can't move laterally with that account because it doesn't go anywhere. The servers don't have access to one another. The user doesn't have access across the entire environment. Every identity is specifically scoped for what it uses. And then securing system access. Homogeneous security control. So a lot of this is going to be automation, right? But the more homogeneous your environment is, whether the servers are all built the same, they're all deployed with the same endpoint, endpoint protection, deploy everything as code. Deploy the configuration as code, deploy the secrets. The more that's automated and deployed, the faster you're going to be able to respond, and the less likely that you're going to have an oops moment of, hey, we left this system misconfigured or unconfigured, or we turned it on to the internet for some unknown reason. And then part of that automation is the ability to quickly rotate secrets. So being able to go through the environment in a matter of days or weeks and rotate every single secret, every single credential in the environment is going to be critical, because when these supply chain attacks occur, you end up needing to take pretty advanced action, and secrets rotation is one of those, and being able to do it without breaking something in the environment is going to be critical. And then finally, the last point I'll make on this is remediating vulnerabilities via incident response processes. So everybody's got a vulnerability management team, and they do their traditional scanning. They work with technology teams to get things patched, get things updated, change configurations, get systems hardened. But when you have something like a MOVEit or a Log4j or a SolarWinds, you really need to stand up via your incident response team and have an incident commander who's treating that vulnerability and answering the questions of whether it exists in the environment, whether you're vulnerable, what the current configurations are, what the patch levels are, and how many systems have been remediated as part of that process and incident. That really falls more in line with what incident response does. So running that as an incident will help drive those answers, because vulnerability management teams are typically not built for that level of speed and answers. They don't typically have the networks within the company with legal, with privacy, with other stakeholders to say, okay, we've potentially got this vulnerability. What do we need to do now? So a lot of times if we have one of those 0 days, a supply chain attack, and we need to get to an answer, we run it via an incident. And then when you end up in the reporting stage, you're talking about an incident without impact, or hopefully an incident without impact, versus trying to run it as a vulnerability and, hey, we need to patch 50 systems, and then it gets lost in the ether of your traditional vulnerability management reporting. Instead, you can report on it as an actual incident. All right, I'd like to invite Amit and Jignesh up.
Thank you, Larry.
Absolutely.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Amit Chaudhary, and I'm the Senior Director for Product Marketing at Cloudflare. And we have Jignesh Joshi, Director of Application and Network Security at Genentech, Roche. And what I would like to do is have a little bit of a fireside chat to bring together the practicalities of how do you manage a supply chain as intense and as broad as what Roche and Genentech has, and how do you really secure that environment, and kind of put together a little bit of things that Larry talked about in his session, and kind of bring it all together so that practically learning from someone who has to deal with this on a day-to-day basis, how do you really do that, and probably just pick some words of wisdom from Jignesh of his work that he does on every day to secure Roche and Genentech environment. Thank you, Jignesh.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So Jignesh, let's start with understanding how big is the environment. I mean, you're one of the leaders of the pharmaceutical industry, and anybody and everybody knows that it's a pretty diverse environment of suppliers and third-party suppliers, fourth-party suppliers. Lay us the infrastructure landscape that you're dealing with.
Sure. I mean, I'm part of Genentech. Genentech is known for like a birthplace of biotech.
Yeah.
It's more popularly known in North America as Genentech, but we are also a wholly owned subsidiary of Roche, which is the top 5 pharma companies, as you mentioned.
Right.
So in terms of scale, we operate in 80 plus countries with about 120,000 plus employees, spread worldwide, and about as many number of externals also, right? In terms of our IT and software landscape, I would say about 15 to 20,000 contracts.
Wow.
Software contracts in our file, from 2,500 to 2,700 IT vendors, right? So that's our supply chain. Talk about the perimeter, right? And the nature of business that we are in, right? So we have to comply. It's highly regulated, and we are governed by good GXP practices, good manufacturing, good clinical practices. In addition to that, now every country has their own regulations that we have to abide by, that we need to follow. So that gives you a context of the scale and the complexity of what we work with.
So, well, that's massive, right? So I think one of the things that we talk about, or Larry talked about, is the attack surface. One of the key things in any cybersecurity prevention is protecting the attack surface. But in this case, of course, a physical supply chain has many different connection points, and so therefore the cyber supply chain has well. Now, in case of Roche, when you talk about 15, 20,000 suppliers and contracts and things like that, that's a lot of basically points of vulnerabilities and exploitation. So how do you prioritize cybersecurity? Like, how do you manage your environment in such a way that there is obviously you kind of prevent any of those bad things to happen, And more importantly, what kind of learnings have you had from the supply chain attacks of the past? Obviously the most infamous one is the SolarWinds attack that really kind of shook everyone. So give us a little bit of that perspective.
Yeah, you are right. I think a few years ago, this was a non-issue. We would implicitly trust our suppliers, but SolarWinds really changed the conversation and changed the gear. So, we don't have to leave what we are doing. So our motto, our CEO always reminds us is, hey, we want to deliver that medicine that patient needs today and tomorrow. That means we want to make sure that we have a right to operate, continue to do our research, continue to manufacture the medicines, and we are able to ship those medicines. Now, how do we do that? So Larry, pointed out the 5 pillars. We follow all of those to most extent, but philosophically we shifted, saying that, hey, we have some zero trust principles and zero trust vision that we use to protect our perimeter. How do we extend that now beyond our perimeter? Because essentially it boils down to, the cyber supply chain attacks is, how do we narrow that down or minimize that? Now, I think Larry mentioned that, hey, we cannot control what is outside our perimeter, but we can definitely influence it, right? So what we started doing a few years ago is we consolidated our vendor management, which used to be, imagine operating in 80 plus countries with just 15,000, 20,000 IT contracts. So we consolidated and we started managing our vendors from a central office, which follows a rigorous vendor risk assessment. So that is a first step. The conversations that we were not having with the vendor before, now we are having those hard questions, asking for certifications, third-party certifications, asking for reports of if they have done any penetration testing in their environment, and we want to see those. Do they participate in CVE publications to, and creations of vulnerabilities? We have started having data processing agreements and putting things in contract. Good vendors want to be held accountable, and if you put that language, if you have that conversations, they will be happy to do that. So having that clause in the software contract, so this was not the case a few years ago. So this is the first step that we are doing. Secondly, educating the decision makers within the company. That part, we were a little bit lax earlier, but with SolarWinds, definitely we have changed that in making the decision makers aware that, hey, you can put all the nice process in place, but if the process performers are not up to speed, so that was the second thing that we did. Larry mentioned about privileged access. So once an attacker is in your perimeter, the privileged pathway is the most common, attack trajectory they follow. So having a robust privileged access management system in place. Increase knowing where our IP is, knowing where our confidential data is, and increased scanning for those assets, having penetration testing for those assets. So that's also one of the pillars. So we have increased that. To name a few, and beyond this, the common sense security stuff, moving access in zero trust from like your network and perimeter to identity based, and keep it as narrow as possible.
No, I think, obviously SolarWinds changed the nature of dialogue and conversation within the organizations, right? Because I think the impact of what happened and pretty much changed the nature of security and security management for both government as well as commercial enterprises. But it did brings up the question. I think the things that you talk about, that with so many gates in the process that you just articulated, there's always going to be a balance that has to be to strike between efficiency and security, right? Performance and security. I know that the research it takes to bring out a large molecule in an organization is pretty wide, right? I mean, it takes a long time, which means that the IP that has to be safeguarded is for a much longer time as well. So how do you balance these two things, right? What is like putting these gates in along the way that's great because suddenly the security part or the CISO office has now a lot more credibility and a lot more responsibility along the process. Right. But line managers and people who are actually doing the research, getting them, they're not looking for, I need to do an access at every point in time. So how do you kind of maintain that balance between efficiency and security? I mean, I'm assuming that would have been a wonderful conversation in the boardroom to discuss about what's going to be my response to that.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's like how do you balance security and efficiency or security and user experience, right?
Yeah.
I mean, up until few years ago, we used to struggle with that. And then I think we got the wisdom that, hey, the security does not have to come at a cost of user experience. I know it sounds like one of those diet plans. You can eat whatever you want and not gain weight, right? But I think I'll give you a couple of examples. For example, we started onboarding our web applications, HTTPS to Cloudflare. We have about 1,000 plus applications. And just by doing that, we eliminated the need of folks, the users, to be on our corporate network. That means these applications are now available, accessible from anywhere, right? So we implemented a security control, but at the same time, we are providing superior user experience. Hey, our calls to our IT help desk because, hey, with VPN, I'm not able to access this, those issues are gone, right? So, and people are happy. So security, we implemented better user experience. I'll give you another example. When we moved to single sign-on and MFA, single sign-on to access our entire landscape, right, for both internals and externals. There were pushback. You are right, it's a change and whatnot. But what an experience. We cut down calls to our IT help desk about resetting password, which identity to use, right? So I think if security is done right, I think you don't have to compromise on user experience. In fact, you will make your life, as an IT organization much better and provide a better user experience.
You actually bring us to a point which I wanted to really emphasize to the audience as well. I think this is the concept of what we all are going through called digital transformation. And what does digital transformation means? There's a digital transformation and then there is secure digital transformation. I think in a lot of ways, digital transformation for a lot of us started about 10, maybe 15 years ago when cloud became, and cloud got introduced and most of the organizations started moving their application or re-platforming their application. You talked about the fact that you're moving about thousands of those applications into the cloud, which is actually the right thing to do because you're looking for agility, you're looking for speed, you're looking for efficiency, you're looking for user experience. But then application modernization, which is what we call that, requires a network to be modernized as well. Because the access, like you said, has to be done at every location, at every device. It doesn't really have to be whether you need to bring your own own device or the company sanctioned device and things like that. But the most critical part of that whole process is that if the network has to be modernized, security has to be modernized as well, because you cannot really allow those 4 stages of attack that Larry talked about, and most specifically is the compromise is not the issue. It is the flat network. Once the malware or a ransomware is in the network, you talk about least privilege access because everything is available. It's almost like you're riding an interstate. You can go from, once you're an interstate, you can either go to Miami or you can go to Chicago, depending on where you are, which is what most of the hackers are doing. And it comes down to the principles of zero trust and least privilege access to essentially give everyone the credentials and the risk-based scoring that allows them the access to different applications. So that actually brings us down to the question, Larry, which is very selfish to me and which is why I'm here, is how is Cloudflare helping you out?
Sure. I mean, our journey with Cloudflare, it was like an accidental, basically. We started using Cloudflare for, before pre-Cloudflare, we used to let our application solution architects manage the security at an application level, right? So, and imagine doing that for thousands of applications. So you end up with like a mushroom-like, different spaghetti security in place. So we brought in Cloudflare for a simple vanilla, WAF solution, and CDN was kind of icing on the cake, right? We started with like, 10s, 20s, 50 applications, for first year, and as we started using it, we loved it so much because of the simplicity of it, and now. As I mentioned, we have 1,000+ applications. We are doing a lot of other things, crazy things with Cloudflare, and it has become a key player, a key component to our Zero Trust vision, right? So the things that, for example, we are doing with Cloudflare, so I told you, I mean, our goal is to provide access to any application from anywhere. So we have started that with web application, but we are also looking at VDI kind of workloads as well, to move those. You talked about securing networks and layers of networks, right? So the Cloudflare DDoS prevention. So our entire network is behind Cloudflare DDoS prevention. So your L4 is secure.
Secured,
right? Putting thousands of applications, thousands of domains behind Cloudflare. That means SSL, TLS management. We don't have to worry about any of the certificate renewal. It used to be those many tickets for our IT staff to renew certificates, right? And we don't have to do that anymore. So, so that's your layer 6, right?
Yeah.
We love, I think you talked about remote browser isolation, right? So we are working to provide application access for externals. Imagine 100,000+ externals. Not everybody gets our company managed device, but there is a large population that gets that access. And all they do, right, if they have to work on a spreadsheet or some financial document, hey, you can do that with a browser, right? So with remote browser isolation, we eliminate the need of shipping those devices no matter where those contractors are, right? So your browser, a managed browser, is your device. Now, right? So talk about the cutting cost, talk about the reducing complexity, and
Reduce
it
risk.
takes, reducing risk, doing it in a secure way, and a contractor who joins, Roche Genentech, can start working day zero.
Okay.
Basically, if they have a laptop, and we can provision identity in seconds, and they can start working, right? So yeah, you need a good partner, good technology. There are people out there. So it does play a very key role, and we like Cloudflare. In addition to that, we are moving security left, so the shift left approach, with moving it to developers as well, with a lot of developer tools, API shields, data localization, advanced rate limiting, and whatnot. Yeah.
Wow, that's fantastic. I mean, I don't think even I could have said it any better. Just to kind of remind you, 80 countries Roche and Genentech is. Cloudflare has 320 POPs in 120 countries. So what Jignesh is talking about is an experience that is true for anyone. You could have 50 milliseconds is what separates Cloudflare to the nearest user because of our wide network. And we protect about 20% of the web. So we bring, that allows us to have superior intelligence of predetermining what kind of threats are actually getting exploited. Imagine the responsibility that comes with managing 20% of the web. So the fact that we are fighting those vulnerabilities and exploitations at the internet level is what brings Cloudflare and makes Cloudflare what it is right now. So I think what Jignesh has brought about is a very large example of something which is being experienced by many, many enterprises across the world. And I would encourage you to take a look at what Cloudflare can do for your security. We have a booth downstairs, or you can come to cloudflare.com and get a sense of that. I got one more question, and then we can actually open it up for questions if anybody in the audience has. So we are entering, whether you call it the fourth wave of revolution or fifth wave of revolution, and this is all about AI, right? Clearly, I think it is going to fundamentally change the nature of our lives going forward, and I think we have already started experiencing some benefits of that. And it's also going to transform how organizations are going to be operating. Today, Gen AI is available. A lot of people are using it. Talk a little bit about how is Genentech going to, again, manage this AI revolution where you obviously don't want a whole bunch of your data to be available in the cloud or in those specific areas. So what's your AI strategy? I mean, I don't know whether you have one, but what's the vision for that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that has definitely created a conversation again, that we were not having earlier. We are in the early stages of adopting and creating and employing our own AI applications, but it definitely opens up an attack surface which was not there before, right? And there is no standard template. It's very, very subjective to the organization. So, for example, we plan to use AI. We are piloting to make certain decisions and certain inferences for us, or do certain tasks, right? Now, the data that is used for those inferences, right? Are they, does it have any kind of confidential data? Are these inferences, that are created, can they be exposed externally, or it is just for internal uses? And if it's internal, do everybody in Roche Enterprise can see it, or is it only for a certain number of people, access, right? Yeah. So those kind of questions we are asking. What can we put in place to protect that? How can we not break or be in the news for the wrong reasons by breaking country-specific data localization laws and regulations, right? So we know that there are tools available and capabilities available in Cloudflare to handle some of it, right? But as I said, we are in the early stages of asking a lot of questions and putting things in place. But I think if we were to have the same conversation next year, I'll be able to share more.
I think I want to remind the audience here is that a huge part of managing your AI risk comes with very simple things of having visibility and control of your environment. And a large part of what happens in today's, in most of the enterprises, that because there is a huge plethora of legacy applications or legacy infrastructure or legacy technologies that kind of creates a basket of services, which is highly inefficient, which has been cobbled up together with some level of platforming, but it does not really give you that control or the visibility to be able to be ready for these kind of new technologies and new attacks that are going to happen. And last but not the least, the security that I think Larry's talking about. Once you have a huge understanding of your security parameter, actually it's what we call a security awareness within the organization. And think about a company like Roche or Genentech, which is massively thousands and thousands of people. Having that level of visibility, control, and security awareness is the only reason where you could actually have the ability to have an AI policy, which basically gives you the ability to be prepared for the future. Any advice for everyone in this room?
Sorry. I know we're about to get the hook, And I did want to make sure that if there were any questions, we could either answer them now, or I'd be happy to meet anybody out in the hallway. Please.
Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights. I really appreciate it.
Could be a little louder, sir.
Thank you very much for sharing your insights. My question is maybe not so much a question as more like then and now, then the day before SolarWinds.
Yeah.
Now we're talking about zero trust. We're talking about extending the zero trust to the vendors. So how confident are you now that if another highly leveraged state actor was to pull off something like SolarWinds or NotPetya, like how much better off are you now than you were then?
I can take the answer, but would love to get your support as well. So one of the things that, coming from a security company, I would say is that it's very hard to say that another attack is never going to happen. I don't think anybody is ever going to be able to stake the claim or put their name on that. I think the question that we have to address is prevention, detection, and remediation. Those are the three things that you can really be prepared for. And I think zero trust is one way to do that. Larry talked about 5 different ways of resiliency, especially in the case of supply chain attack. I think there are things that you could do in your processes, and a company like Genentech and Roche can do it. Anybody else can do that as well. So I think there are different ways to attack that problem. One thing I do want to say is that it's not a question of most CISOs, if you ask today, and we keep having this conversation, nobody really says that I can 100% guarantee that there's no attack going to happen. It's all about preventing your the next one by reducing or minimizing the attack surface, making sure that the compromise that happens when a malware gets deposited. So you have multi-channel phishing solutions that essentially prevent that kind of compromise in your network, making sure that you have least privilege access where your flat network gets a lot more security gateways along the way. And last but not the least is making sure that before a data exfiltration happens, you create a lot more of those processes and technology. So I would say is that in my mind, it's not about whether it will happen or not. I think there are different ways to prevent that. But let's talk from somebody who's actually doing it on a day-to-day basis. Like, what would be your opinion on that?
No, I think I echo what Amit said, and I'll give a COVID example, right? For example, we dealt with COVID. Will there be another virus like that? Yes. But are we better prepared to manage and control the risk? Definitely yes, right? So, and it's a good thing. We all will have employment, and then, but I think as long as we can reduce the risk and we know how to recover and having that kind of rapid response, always, and I think we are getting better.
Jignesh, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jignesh. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Larry.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.